the documentary was over, I was sitting there, I was, just thinking about animals and, this idea that it's the public that owns all of the animals, right? The public owns the moose, and the public owns the elk, and the public own, the grizzly bears, to the extent that we can call that ownership, right? But you just raised the point that for a lot of these ranchers, many of whom have thousands of acres, it is their ranch that is supporting the life of all of these animals.
The resource, yeah.
And they are, you can think about it that there's a monetary impact to them. Either it's the hay, it is, the potential risk that they're incurring by having that animal on their land. And so, the question maybe is, at what point does an animal no longer belong to the public?
Yeah, and that's a great question. I do think, though, when you talk about, okay, do you have a right to grow food and all that, but then, you kind of get into this little bit of a slippery slope deal here, because when we go back to that urban interface, those people in the city, well, what happened in COVID when there wasn't anything in the grocery store? People rioted, right? Mm-hmm. Okay, so when you have governments don't like that, because you want stability. If you don't have stability, you have what happened during COVID, some of the things that happened with, during the whole, Floyd deal and all that stuff, where you've got people that now have license to do whatever they think they want to do, then society breaks down. So getting back to growing food, well, we have private property rights. So you have the right to grow that food and utilize that land the way you want to, within reason, right? We have these societal norms. And so, I think at the end of the day, what I'd like to think is that everybody wants to manage their land and be a good steward of it. And there's going to be those off takes. There's going to be more wildlife on it. You're going to have healthy environment. We're going to have vibrant forest and clean drinking water when we take care of these ecosystems. Which, when you can utilize a resource, like we said earlier, humans tend to do a better job of seeing some sort of benefit. And so, getting back to, do they have a right to grow food on it? Well, we have entire national forests that the federal government manages for berry and mushroom production. Yet we don't have a single national forest that's managed for wildlife production. I think that's a problem. But we also have this problem here in America where you can't eat, or anybody's listeners can't eat wild game unless you go source it yourself, or somebody who's been successful in the field, a hunter. Because it's illegal since our market hunting days to sell wild game. Now, I'm not saying we need to open up the doors and start selling every deer and elk and everything else, but at the end of the day, where we know we have that surplus, we've got this huge disconnect, like we said, with the urban society, where they can't eat wild game, where we historically have done it. So they get everything from the mass packing houses and the big grocery store chains. And it's not always good for us. A lot of it's full of a lot of things that are bad for humans. And we're dealing with all these things, from type 2 diabetes to heart disease and all these other ailments and inflammatory things. Look what RFK Jr. is really pushing on. I think a lot of the things that they're talking about we need to talk about. And so it's real important, because that's what these films are all about. It's like, hey, let's start this conversation. And that value of having that land, you got a responsibility towards it. But again, a lot of those ranchers said, hey, we own the land, but we really don't. We're just caretakers for the time that we're here in our human lifespan.